Now, cholera ravaged the Philippines in the early 1900s. And what people also do not remember is that this was the period where the Filipinos who had just won their independence from Spain were still fighting their independence against the Americans who had come in and taken over the Philippines. So what is hidden in the historical literature was that sometimes the American military officials used health as a way to contain the rebellion. So they would hamlet people. So they would make an excuse of, there is cholera in this part of town, so we have to bring people from the fields and bring them into a quarantine space. They would bring them into a town, burn houses, supposedly to sanitize them, burn fields to sanitize, but also to starve off Emilio Aguinaldo's forces. So when you look at the cholera epidemic, you see a two-pronged fight, which was a fight to stop Philippine aspirations for independence and also a fight against disease. Cholera was so fearful that in 1902, the Americans ordered the burning of a whole district called Farola in Tondo. We don't really know if it was really disease or they're trying to ferret out people they didn't like from that place, but they burned an entire section of Manila in order to cleanse it. Cholera's most prominent victim was Apolinario Mabini, who had returned from exile in Guam and lived along the Pasig River, and he died. And everyone just remembers this. He's a great hero of the Philippines. We do not remember that Mabini actually died of cholera after drinking tainted Carabao milk. So when he had returned home, he was so, he missed food from home, he missed having Carabao milk, so he drank this. It was not pasteurized, so he died of cholera. And the protocol for cholera in 1903 was that you cremate the body, there's no wake and there's no funeral. But Mabini, being who he was, he had one of the biggest funerals of the time. Hundreds of people came to bid him farewell, and he was buried not in the Christian North Cemetery, he was buried in the Chinese cemetery. So if you go there today, you will see the former grave, because he has been moved to Batangas. His grave actually has a pyramid, which is a Masonic sign. And the historical marker actually says there that Mabini died of cholera. Today we buy water, bottled water, which we all claim is sanitized. And for some strange reason, vendors always call it mineral water when it's not really mineral water, it's just filtered water. People don't seem to know the difference between filtered water, mineral water, distilled water. As long as it's in a bottle, people think it's clean. And this frame of mind, I think, goes all the way back to the pre-war period, when people felt that buying bottled water was safer than buying it from an itinerant vendor. Now, we have pictures of milk vendors in the Philippines. People selling milk house to house, fresh from a cow or a carabao or a goat without pasteurization. In the early 1920s, 1930s, we have an advertisement for Magnolia milk. Fresh milk which is pasteurized and clean. So the advertisements were about drinking pure, safe milk from a factory in a bottle, not bought from an itinerant vendor. Then we also have ice cream. Dirty ice cream, again, came because we were thinking of sanitation. The disease was also spread not just through milk, but through water. So in the 19th century, when people really didn't have connections of water, you had to buy water from a water vendor. And you're not quite so sure where that water comes from. So people started to boil water or to put them in clay jars or tapayan, which had some sort of a filter. So people would put them there to cool the water and to sanitize them. And later on, from the US and from England, there were ready-made water filters that were put in homes. And a Filipino actually created a water filter system in a clay or ceramic jar. Then we started to buy bottled water. So today, people are buying bottled water instead of drinking straight from the tap. But in the pre-war period, we had bottled water, a fizzy water called tansan. Today, tansan is the Philippine word for the bottle cap. And I think we got that from this Japanese branded water called tansan. If you go to Japan today, the word for bubbly water or carbonated water is tansan. So from the word, we see all sorts of things. Another advertisement that's quite interesting is Royal True Orange. Royal True Orange today is a soft drink. Before the war, there were over 20 different flavors of this soft drink, which was made by the San Miguel Corporation. And if you compare Royal True Orange ads today, which is about how this is a refreshing sweet drink, if you look at the pre-war ads for Royal True Orange, it advertises that it is pure, it is safe, it is sanitary. Again, it shows you that some soft drink that we drink today was advertised differently in the past. The Americans had to change the way in which people, Filipinos, used to do things. And they realized that one of the modes of transmission was because Filipinos ate with their hands. We have a distinct way of eating with their hands. So they started to teach people to wash their hands with soap and water before and after eating. And we actually have advertisements of Pear soap, which says the white man's burden. And the guy washing his hands is George Dewey, the hero of the Battle of Manila Bay. And in this particular advertisement, it talks about how the march of civilization pushes away dirt and blackness and darkness into a new world. Another advertisement of Pear soap, which is very racist, shows two children, a white child and a black child. The black child is in a bathtub, submerged up to the neck, and the white child gives the black child Pear soap. So it's used in the bathtub, and when the black child comes up, his body is all white except for the face, which wasn't washed with Pear soap. So aside from washing the hands, the Americans also introduced, on a large scale, teaching children to eat not with their hands but with a knife and a fork. And in the Philippines, we use a spoon to eat our rice with. So they had fork and knife clubs. What would happen here was a public school child would go home and tell the parents who probably didn't go to school that we have to use cutlery. We have to use knife, spoon, and fork at home to eat. So it was changing the way of doing things. In the Philippines also, we had roadside carinderias. There were no restaurants as we know them today, or not as much, especially outside the cities. So people would buy food from the street. And we have photographs of them, from a roadside stall. You didn't know how the food was prepared or where it came from. So the Americans became very strict about food preparation, selling of food, licensing of food. And this changed the whole way in which we eat, source, and get our food. In the 19th century, we actually have some watercolor pictures of roadside stands. There are some which are quite fascinating because they show Chinese vendors. The woman is sitting on a stool and she's eating with chopsticks. And this is the mid-19th century. But the Chinese who's giving the noodles into the bowl or the plate is getting it with his or her hands. It is not as sanitary as we would like to think. By the 1920s, 1930s, people would say that Chinese food was not clean, And we have drawing in Lipang Calabao by Fernando Amorsolo showing the 4 specialties of the Chinese. And one really funny frame from this cartoon shows a Chinese pulling up a cat from a kettle. So I think this is the beginning of the urban legend that the Chinese put cat meat in their siopao, which some of my Chinese friends actually call xiao miao. But this goes all the way back. It goes back and tells us about sanitation and the way in which the Americans changed civilization as we know it. In textbooks and in magazines and newspapers, they would talk about the spread of disease. So we have pictures of how somebody spitting. They had to tell us not to spit in public. But remember, in the 19th century, early 20th century, people would chew betel nut and they would spit everywhere. And so this was supposed to be unsanitary. So they would draw the spread of disease from somebody's spit. It would be held by a child, germs spread through the air, the same way that we are told that disease spreads today. The 1918 flu pandemic killed 50 million people worldwide, and it is estimated that 500 million people were infected. And yet, despite the magnitude of this pandemic, nobody seems to remember it in the Philippines. When you Google it, you will find out that many people describe it as the Spanish flu. But if you read on, you will find out that it did not come from Spain. And that in Spain, this flu epidemic, they called the flu the French disease, or they called it the Naples soldier. So there is a way of making a disease racist. So like in Senegal, during the pandemic, they called it the Brazilian flu. In Poland, it was referred to as the Bolshevik disease. In Germany, it was called the Russian pest. And in Russia, they called it the Chinese flu. So it makes the infection another person or someone outside of who or where you are. In the Philippines, the flu was simply called trancaso, which is still the word that we use to describe the flu today. And if you look at the advertisements, you will see there is something about washing your hands, wearing a face mask, taking nutritious food like milk and meat. There's even an advertisement in the US that says that a good massage will also keep you from the flu. The thing here is that we have no living memory of past pandemics, but traces of these remain in our ordinary day-to-day life, like palaspas or dirty ice cream, or the way in which we now eat with a spoon and fork instead of our hands. What the pandemic is supposed to make us remember is supposed to let us see the past, to see how disease has influenced the way in which we are today and probably influences the way in which we process or we face disease today. So the pandemic, the history of pandemics in the Philippines is supposed to teach us not so much about how many people died or how it was treated, but it shows us that history is important because it is not enough to see history. One has to notice it in order for it to become relevant in your lives and to change us into a better future.